Identifying with any fictional work seems almost counterintuitive at first. After all, how could one identify with a made-up world full of made-up characters, especially when themes such as magic and fantasy are involved? However, identifying with fictional works is essential to the isekai genre, a genre in which the main character, usually a male Japanese teenager or salaryman, is reborn through one way or another in another world. This genre has seen a massive rise in popularity within the past decade, notably gaining a massive boost in popularity, especially in Western countries in 2012 with the release of Sword Art Online, a Japanese anime about a boy who becomes trapped in a video game world, similar to Spy Kids 3 but with way more teen angst. Although iconically controversial, Sword Art Online brought about a large rise in popularity in the isekai genre of anime, especially among young adults and teenagers. A large part of the reason for the popularity of this genre is the idea of escapism, which is defined as the tendency to seek distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, especially by seeking entertainment or engaging in fantasy. In a sense, escapism in the isekai genre is the idea of identifying with fantasy for the sake of distracting yourself from reality. In this essay, I want to explore identification as a rhetorical concept in the isekai genre, and how identification, or a lack thereof, changed how audiences received my personal favorite isekai anime, Mushoku Tensei, Jobless Reincarnation. To start, I want to identify identity and identification as a rhetorical concept. To do this, I will be mostly using Rhetorical Listening and Action by Krista Radcliffe and Kyle Jensen. In Chapter 4 of this book, Radcliffe and Jensen go into great detail describing what identification is as a rhetorical concept. The authors of this book heavily referenced Kenneth Burke, author of A Rhetoric of Motives, when talking about identification as a rhetorical concept. Here, Radcliffe and Jensen state that, according to Burke, quote, "People and institutions use language to facilitate identifications by assigning properties to themselves, other people, objects, spaces, and rhetorical situations in order to bridge divides and establish relationships among people, as well as among people and things." What this means is that the role that identification plays in rhetoric is that it bridges gaps between people and whatever the subject at hand is. For example, one who identifies as a feminist would be linked to others by beliefs and actions that further women's rights. Radcliffe and Jensen then wrote that, according to Burke, quote, "Properties assigned in identifications may be deemed accurate or inaccurate, comforting or dangerous, or even real or imagined, depending on the situation. For example, one who has identified as outgoing and confident may act entirely different in private situations. This is very important to remember, as it means that identification can be flawed and can misrepresent the truth within something or someone. That being said, the authors still indicate the importance of identification as a rhetorical concept, stating that, quote, "Identifications are necessary because people live in a natural state of division and conflict. As such, people desire to overcome this division and bridge their differences with other people or things." To summarize, identification as a rhetorical concept is the act of assigning a property or properties to some person, object, or to oneself in order to bridge a gap. It is necessary to overcome differences and create connection. Having defined identity as a rhetorical tool, let's now apply it to the isekai genre to see how rhetorical identification plays a role in how audiences receive this form of storytelling. Isekai, or another world, is a genre in which the main character, usually a male Japanese teenager or salaryman, is reborn through one way or another in another world. The genre has expanded to include more of a variety in cast, but the vast majority share this style of main character. A Japanese male who dies and is reborn in another world, who brings his knowledge of the past into his new world. Another similarity is that most isekai are fantasy shows. Identity is a major part of isekai, especially when it comes to this main character. A term used to describe many protagonists for these shows is self-insert, meaning that the character is literally written so that the watchers can identify with the main characters and insert themselves into their shoes. Usually this results in men with short black hair who all generally look the same, a trait designed to appeal with Japanese audiences. And it is also important to note that due to how high school is generally viewed as a high point in many Japanese citizens' lives, most of these protagonists are also in that high school age group. Audiences are able to identify with these protagonists because they are literally created to be related to. By creating a character as a blank slate, the viewer is able to identify with them more easily, building a connection between character and viewer, and in the process also bridges the gap between fantasy and reality. Now that we have a good idea of how rhetorical identification applies to the isekai genre, I will now present an actual example of a fairly controversial show that highly depends on how the reader identifies with the content. To summarize, Mushoku Tensei is an isekai show about a 40-year-old deadbeat who dies and reincarnates as a baby boy. As he grows, this boy, now called Rudius, acts more like an adult than a child, learning to read within 3 years and learning advanced magic techniques within 5 years of being reincarnated. As Rudius continues to grow, he gains more connections, such as his magic teacher and his childhood friend, and eventually lands a tutoring job at a lord's manor. After a few years of that job, he gets caught in a disaster that leads to him journeying across a continent of demons alongside Eris, the girl he had been previously tutoring, who also ends up developing feelings for him. Looking at audience reception of this show, it is obvious that while the direction of the show as a whole was well received, the main character remains a subject of controversy. For starters, Rudius is a very crude character, leading to many seeing him as a creepy person. On top of this, some people see him as essentially a 40-year-old man who is living in this new young body, which, combined with his tendency to see women as sources of pleasure despite their age, made a bad impression on many viewers. However, despite his shortcomings, the story focuses heavily on the themes of redemption, and the idea that even though he built up these tendencies over the course of 40 years, and even though his actions can never be undone, he has been given a second chance to redeem himself and be the person he never could have been before. Many people see this side of the story and generally receive it much better than the former, and it all comes down to how audiences identify with Rudius. As previously mentioned, isekai protagonists are literally designed to be identified with, and I believe that Rudius was meant to appeal to hikikomori. Hikikomori is characterized by adolescents and young adults who become recluses in their parents' homes, unable to work or go to school for months or even years. This is how Rudius is first presented in the show, with him being so much of a social recluse that he didn't even show up to his parents' funeral. It is also revealed early in his new life that the reason for his reclusion is that he was severely bullied to the point where even looking outside caused panic attacks, which is also the real-life cause for many people becoming hikikomori in the first place. I also want to note that in 2021 alone, Japan reported over 600,000 incidents involving some form of bullying, meaning that this is a very well-known issue, and in all likelihood, many Japanese viewers could understand where he's coming from. Bringing all these connections together, as well as knowing that Rudius went through much of his trauma in high school, which as previously stated is usually seen as a high point in Japanese citizens' lives, the conclusion can be drawn that Japanese audiences are able to identify more than Western audiences, leading to that divide in reception. Western audiences simply have a different culture, and while there are parallels, it is definitely easier for Japanese audiences to identify and close that gap with a Japanese character written by a Japanese author intended for Japanese audiences. Western audiences might be more likely to falsely identify Rudius as hopeless by only seeing him at his worst, while those who are able to identify and are able to more closely understand and relate to him may see that he has truly been given a second chance at life. Rhetorical identity plays a major role in the isekai genre because authors create protagonists that try to relate to viewers as much as possible. It is the way writers establish ideas, motives, values, and interests between themselves and their audiences. Mushoku Tensei also shows that knowing your audience and knowing their culture plays a big role in identity when writing. As for my personal opinions, although I experienced bullying in high school, I can't quite identify with Rudius, as I never experienced anything on the level he ever did, and I definitely can't relate to being reborn in another world. However, I do see that the author really wanted to write this character as a very flawed person who gets things wrong and makes mistakes. Despite it all, he pushes through, and while he's definitely not the best person in the world, he is still just a person trying to right his wrongs. Rudius is nowhere near perfect, and honestly, I can identify with that.